When she was much younger, our then 5-year-old Kelsey's now 22 years old, so she's all grown up. But back then, she would make her way into our bedroom, where Brenda and I were pretty much every night, because she said she was afraid. One of us had always kind of sleepily asked Kelsey, what is it you're afraid of, honey? And the answer was almost invariably the same: shadows. So we would take Kelsey back into her room and examine the shadows with her. We would show her that the shadows couldn't actually do anything to her. We would teach her how to make her own shadows, try to make a game out of it, to make some shadow figures with her hands. We'd explain to her that the only way to eliminate the shadows was to eliminate all the lights, which she didn't want done, of course. Our intention was to try to teach Kelsey that she didn't need to fear the shadows, that the shadows couldn't harm her. But Kelsey was not easily convinced that shadows were harmless. And Kelsey, frankly, is hardly alone in her fear of shadows. Oh, it isn't the shadow itself, of course, that we're afraid of. We know that shadows can't hurt us, but a shadow means that something is blocking the light. And it's that something that can make us afraid. Sheep are afraid of shadows, shepherds tell us. I guess that isn't too surprising, since sheep are pretty much afraid of everything, not able to defend themselves, totally reliant on someone else to care for them. But there are particular shadows that the sheep fear the most, we are told, and it's the shadows of the valley, the shadows that the psalmist refers to in Psalm 23. Look again at the first 4 verses of this most famous of all of the Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, the shepherd says, the sheep says, because you are with me. Let me see if I can explain a little bit of the background about why it is that sheep fear the shadows of the valley, and why is it that the sheep are in the valleys to begin with. Psalm 23, as we've discovered this summer, was written by David, the shepherd boy who grew up to be the second king of Israel. Israel, as you know, is a very arid country. As summer moves along, as the land becomes more and more parched, the only place that the grass grows enough for the sheep to eat it is in the higher elevations. And the best way for the shepherds to get their sheep to those higher elevations is actually by means of the valleys. The valleys not only provide the gentlest grade for the sheep to climb, but the valleys are also, of course, the source of the best water. And sheep need lots of water to survive. So it's very common and very necessary for sheep to spend a fair bit of their year walking through valleys. It's the only logical way for them to reach the lusher, higher ground. But, of course, the valleys have their shadow side, their darker side, if you will. There is evil lurking in the valleys. There are coyotes and bears and wolves and cougars that hide in the valleys and the crevasses of the valleys, ready to pounce on the sheep if it strays away from the herd. Knowing there could well be predators hiding in the shadows, the sheep would naturally be afraid of whatever it is that's right around the next part of the valley. And then, of course, there are rock slides in the valleys. In the wet times of the years, there can be mudslides and flash floods in the valleys. We saw that, I think, this last week or so down in Southern California. Suddenly had some rain, and those dry areas turned into mudslides. Valleys can be dangerous places. They can be dangerous places for sheep, and they can be dangerous places for people. Greg Wilson was guiding a group of 22 people up Mount Rainier back in 1981 in an incident that is sort of infamous to mountaineers. About halfway up the mountain, the group stopped to rest in a small valley. And in the lower left-hand corner of the screen there, you can see some of the people who were on this climbing expedition. Wilson looked up to enjoy the view, to admire the sun that was shimmering off the snow and off the ice, when all of a sudden the sunlight was lost in a large shadow. Wilson looked up to see what was blocking the light when he saw, to his horror, a massive block of ice that had broken off the mountain that was hurtling his way. Within seconds, Greg Wilson was engulfed in a sea of ice and snow, and for a number of moments he thought that this was it, that he was about to die. But he began to fight furiously to escape his would-be tomb. In a few minutes, he had dug himself out of the snow and the ice and discovered, to his amazement, that he was okay. And then he looked around, and he began to count, as any good guide would do, to count the people in his group. Over and over again, he got the same number, 11. It was supposed to be 22, but the number was 11. 11 climbers survived that avalanche. 11 died, buried in the valley by ice and snow. In the blink of an eye, 11 people lost fathers and brothers and friends in an avalanche. It is still, to this day, the worst mountaineering accident in the history of the United States. And those survivors surely understand the fear of the valley of the shadow of death. But the psalmist discovered that when the Lord is his shepherd, he can fear no evil, even when he walks through the valley of the shadow of death. Why? Let's read it again. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. The sheep learned that their shepherd, as long as their shepherd is with them, they don't need to fear the shadows. They don't need to fear what evil might be lurking in the shadows, because they know that who is with them in the light. It is their shepherd. He will protect them. He will care for them. He loves them. And we need to learn the same lesson as the sheep do. Because like it or not, we are going to live a significant portion of our lives in the shadows and in the valleys. Life is not one mountaintop experience after another. There are long and sometimes treacherous valleys in between. And in those valleys there is danger, and there are shadows that darken even the brightest of our days. So this morning we want to spend a few minutes to see if we can discover how to have courage when we walk through the valleys without being overcome by our fear of the shadows. Well, here's the first thing we need to learn. We can have no fear because we matter to God. You know, we're going to be starting this parenting class on Wednesday night, and Vince and Kathleen are going to be helping us lead that group. And, you know, parents, you know that you will practice certain things with your kids. And we're going to be talking about that on Wednesday night in our first group, about some of the things you practice with your youngsters. One of the things that we practiced with our kids when they were young was what to do in the case of emergency and how to dial 9. You remember what number to dial? 9? Yeah, not 963. No. 911, right? They all understood that concept, but for about a year, Kelsey continued to get a little bit mixed up with the numbers. Ask her what number to call in an emergency, and her answer was always the same. She was very consistent with this. 991. One of my fears was that I was going to be left at home, just me and Kelsey, and something was going to happen to me, and I was going to be dependent on her to call for help, and nobody would come because she would keep calling 991. I don't know if you ever watched the old show Rescue 911, hosted by the greatest actor of our time, William Shatner, right? Yeah. Rescue 911. That's probably how you would say it. Anyway, and I watched the show. I was always interested in listening to the people talk about their fears, describe their fears in their particular tragedy, particular emergency, rather. One common fear that most of them seemed to share was the fear that nobody would notice them, that nobody would notice that they needed help. No one would notice that they were missing. No one would notice that they're trapped. No one would notice that they're in a raging river being swept away. And of course, they said their fear was, since nobody was noticing, nobody was going to help them. Nobody's going to do anything for them. You ever had that sort of fear in your life? Ever been afraid that nobody would notice your problem? Well, sometimes it's because you kept it to yourself. You didn't want people to know that you're drowning in life. You need help. But maybe you wanted people to notice, and your fear was that nobody was paying attention. Or maybe you had a different fear. Maybe your fear wasn't just that nobody would notice. Your fear was that no one, even if they noticed, would care. Or maybe they'd care enough to ask how you're doing, but not enough to listen to your answer. Maybe they'd care enough to see your situation, but not care enough to stop. I don't know if you saw this on the news this last week. It was from New York City. It was a robbery in a convenience store, and all videotape, and the videotape shows this man shooting this patron of the convenience store 3, 4, 5 times, then show him lying there. And then the video shows 5 other people in the store come and walk over this person's body and not even look down to help him. They weren't running out because they were scared because the bad guy had already left. They just walked and saw him and stepped over him and left. And that's maybe some of our fears. That happens. Nobody cares enough to help us. Jesus spoke to our fears in Matthew's gospel. Here's what he says. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. He says this, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from the will of your Father. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Jesus says, have no fear because you matter to God. Jesus wants us to know just how much we matter to the Father. That when a tiny sparrow falls to the ground, the Father, the creator of the universe, notices. He not only notices, he cares. We don't need to be afraid that no one will notice our need, Jesus says. We don't need to be afraid that no one will care. God notices, and God cares. This next story, it sounds like it's made up. It's a true story. Earlier in the summer, city workers in Hamilton, Ontario, were trimming limbs from trees along the street. And maybe you're thinking the part of the story that doesn't sound true is city workers working, but no, that's not the part. In one particular tree, they were cutting. They found a nest of baby robins, and to their credit, they decided to not disturb the nest until the young birds had flown away. So they decided, we'll come back another day, and they did. Later, they went up to cut this limb down. They found the nest. They took it. Somebody took it down, and they wanted to look and see what was in it. And they discovered, along with all the sticks and the leaves and other things that the birds had used to make this nest, that there was a little piece of paper in there. One of the workers pulled out the paper, and here's what it said. We trust in the Lord our God. Another reminder. You matter to God. He knows your needs. He knows when you are in the shadows. He knows when you're in the light. He cares about every detail of your life, right from the number of the hairs on your head or in your brush or down the drain. Some of you probably know the name Ben Carson, Dr. Ben Carson. I saw him interviewed on one of the national networks just this last week, and maybe you know his backstory. Ben Carson dedicated himself to becoming a doctor when he was just 8 years old, even though he lived in a ghetto in Detroit at the time, was considered actually at 8 years old one of the dumbest kids in the class. He was one of the kids the teacher said, just, stay over there and do your best. But his mom did not give up on Ben, and his mom had a great faith in God, and so she encouraged him and motivated him, and he continued to work hard until he became the valedictorian of his high school class. He earned a full scholarship to Yale University. Well, at Yale, Carson decided he wanted to be a doctor, so he enrolled in pre-med. And then he discovered, as happened to many of us, I think, that college is kind of a big transition from high school. Not for every kid, but for a lot of us it was. And it was a bit bumpier for him. He was doing well in most of his classes, but he was doing horribly in chemistry. And he knew as a pre-med student he needed to do well in this class. He writes in his biography that he could just see his dreams of becoming a doctor sort of going up in smoke because of this class. Well, the night before his final exam, and he knew he needed to ace this final exam to do well in the class, he's up, he's studying, he's going to stay up all night to do it, and he gets so frustrated, he throws himself across his bed, and he prays this prayer. He says, God, I am so sorry for not studying harder this semester. Please forgive me for failing you and for failing myself. So what do you think? Did God care about Ben Carson and his chemistry test? I mean, with all the problems in the world, And you can just look around at what's going on in the world today, and it wasn't that much different back when Ben Carson was 8 years old. People are starving. Important issues facing our leaders all around the world. In a world like that, would God care about a freshman taking a chemistry exam? Here's how Ben Carson tells the story. He says, that night, the night before his final, I dreamed that I was sitting in the chemistry lecture hall. The door opened, and someone walked into the room and started working out chemistry problems on the board. I took notes of everything he wrote. He says, then I woke up, and I could remember the problems I dreamed about. So hurriedly, I wrote them down before they failed my memory. Then he goes on to talk about the next morning. He says, my steps sounded hollow on the wooden floor as I walked into the lecture hall. I was numb from cramming and from despair. The professor came in and handed out booklets of examination questions to the 600 students in the Yale freshman chemistry class. At last, heart pounding, I opened the booklet and I read the first problem. And he says, at that moment, I thought I'd entered a twilight zone or some sort of never land. I skimmed through the booklet, laughing to myself with joy and with disbelief. The exam problems turned out to be identical to those written by the shadowy dream figure in my sleep. Ben Carson got a 97% on that chemistry exam. He passed chemistry. He became the director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins University. He has saved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lives over the years, every one of which mattered to God. You might know there's even a campaign to get Ben Carson to run for president in 2016. Here's the thing, if God cares about a sparrow that falls to the ground, you can buy 2 for a penny. You know he cares about you. And so Jesus tells us this, have no fear because you matter to God. The second point of our morning is this, have no fear because God is going to be with you. Of course, it's something for us to know that somebody cares about us. It's another thing for someone to care enough about you to walk with you through the valley of the shadow of death. The sheep could live without fear of the shadows, not only because they knew their shepherd cared, but because they knew their shepherd was there, which is why the psalmist wrote, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. As I look back on my years as a pastor, 20-some years now, it occurs to me that I have officiated at more funerals than weddings over the years. I've watched firsthand as people I cared about very much have walked through the valley of the shadow of death. And that's just going to continue to go on, isn't it? My mom is 94, and she's walking through that valley right now as her health diminishes. And then someday it'll be my brother. Someday it'll be my turn. It'll be a turn for every one of us. I wish that wasn't so. I wish I could stand up here and say that if you just believe in Jesus with all your heart, make him the Lord of your life, you won't have to worry about sickness or pain or suffering or death. I wish I could tell you the Good Shepherd would help us to avoid all of the valleys and all of the shadows. But that isn't what the Good Shepherd promises us. And David understood that when he wrote this psalm, Psalm 23. He understood that the Lord did not promise to take us around the valley of the shadow of death. He wouldn't take us away from the valley of the shadow of death. That he was going to take us through it. And what comforted David, what gave him the courage to announce that he could fear no evil, was his confidence that the Good Shepherd would be with him as he walked through the valley of the shadow of death. Some of you are going to remember this story well. For some of you, this sounds like an odd story. It's the story of 3 boys, 3 young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who discovered exactly what David meant when he had written this psalm, Psalm 23, about 400 years before they came along. If you remember the story, Israel had been conquered by the Babylonians, who had deported Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from Jerusalem to Babylon to reprogram them and to make them of some use to them. In fact, those are not their Hebrew names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those are their Babylonian names that had been given to them. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, built an image of gold to represent the Babylonian god and ordered everyone to bow before it every time they heard the national anthem of their time played. And everyone, of course, obeyed. Everyone except these three oddly named friends. They refused, claiming that the Lord God alone is God, that he alone is to be worshipped and obeyed. Well, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't take kindly to their disobedience, and he threatens to throw them into a fire and have them burned to death. Here is their response, one of my favorite passages in the Bible. They say to him, these three young men, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." And in our prayer time this morning before the service, Sharon was praying about this, and it just brought me back to mind this incident. Some of the things we're seeing going on in Iraq right now, where some of our Christian brothers and sisters are being persecuted and told to convert to Islam or to die. And the news showed one horrific story, fortunately they edited it this week, of an elderly man, an elderly Christian man, who was told, you've got to renounce your faith in Jesus or die. And he was beheaded because he said, no, even if God doesn't rescue me, I am going to trust him. He is the Lord and he is God. And that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say to Nebuchadnezzar, which really irritates him. I mean, the audacity of these three kids challenging the king of the most powerful country on the planet. Well, just to prove his point, and because he's a little bit ticked, Nebuchadnezzar orders the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and then has Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego tied up and thrown into the fire by some of his strongest men. The Bible tells us the flames were so hot that the soldiers who throw these 3 men into the furnace all immediately die, just as they get close to the fire. So what do you think is going through the minds of these 3 guys as they're about to be thrown into the furnace? You ever wondered what you would think about if you were in that situation? This is it. You're about to die. These guys are truly in the shadow of death. As strong as their faith was, I got to wonder if maybe they had a moment or two where they thought, why is God doing this? What's going on? I wonder, since the Psalm 23 had been written 400 years before, if they even were thinking about this psalm, if they were thinking to themselves, maybe reciting it out loud, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. And guess what? God was. The Lord was with them. Here's how the story unfolds. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire? And they replied, well, certainly, O king. And he said, well, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods. If the Lord is your shepherd, you can know he will always be with you. He will never leave you alone. He will never abandon you. He will never desert you, never forget you. God does not just care about you from afar, from a distance, like the old Beth Midler song. He will be there for you up close and personal, through thick or thin, flood or flame. The psalmist tells us this, have no fear. Our God will be with you. And to be sure we get this very important point, God sent his only son, Jesus, to come and live with us. One of the names the Bible uses in reference to Jesus is, of course, the name Emmanuel. We talk about this at Christmas time. When we translate that name, we get this, God with us, Emmanuel. And throughout his life, Jesus drove that same point home to his followers. When the disciples were in a small boat about to be capsized by a violent storm, Jesus came walking to them on the water and said, take courage, it's I, don't be afraid. Jesus didn't just care about the disciples from the safety of the shore, from the warmth of a hotel suite. He walked out to them in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the lake, to be with them, because that's what a good shepherd does. When the disciples were walking through the valley of the shadow of death, Jesus was with them. And if he is your shepherd, he will be with you. Jesus' last words to those of us who follow him were these. You might remember them. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Let me end by how I began. We found one surefire way to help Kelsey deal with her fear of the shadows. It was very simple. I don't know why it took us a while to figure it out. We gave her a flashlight. It is both a principle of science and a principle of theology that light overcomes darkness. So when Kelsey saw a shadow that frightened her, she simply shone the flashlight on the shadow, and voila, the shadow is gone. In John 8, Jesus told us how we can have the same power over the shadows of our lives. Here are his words. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. If we follow Jesus, we'll never walk in darkness. If we follow Jesus, the light of the world, the light of the sun will never slip behind the horizon, never leave us to face the shadows alone. Here is the message of Psalm 23. Make Jesus the light of your world. Make the words of Psalm 23 your words, your own words. Say them like this. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. The band's going to come and lead us in a couple more songs of worship as we give our praise and adoration to the one who is with us, to the one who loves us so dearly. And as the band comes up, would you stand with me in a moment of prayer? And let's talk to the Good Shepherd. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you are our shepherd and that you are good. We thank you that we can know that you notice everything that happens in our lives, that you know all those things that cause us to be afraid, that cause us to be anxious, to cause us to lose sleep at night. The things that we worry about. Will we have enough money? Who's going to take care of me if something happens to me? What about my kids? Are they going to be okay? God, you know the things that creep into our minds in the middle of the night, sometimes while we're driving. And so, God, we just want to say, God, will you take those fears away from us? Will you give us the courage to face all the different situations in our lives, knowing that we are not alone, but that you are with us? Lord, I pray that you would empower us, that you'd fill us with the power of your Spirit, that you'd help us to see the light and to know that you are the light of the world. Would you dispel all the shadows, God? Would you wash away all the fears? For we pray these things in the name of our good shepherd, our Lord Jesus. Amen.